Hello and welcome to the Modern Python Packaging Hackfest. As you might know, the Python packaging guidelines were recently rewritten, and there's a bunch of new macros around that can help you simplify Python packaging in Fedora. In this workshop, we can look at your spec file and introduce these new macros, or we can help you package something entirely new into Fedora. But first, a bit of background. For a long time, upstream Python packaging was done with setup tools. To build a package, you'd use Python setup-py-build, and to install it, you'd use Python setup-py-install. To run any of these commands, you'd need setup tools installed. However, setup tools has its issues. It's not a good fit for all projects, and yet it was hard not to use it. There are some other tools that can make Python packages, like Flit or Poetry. These all had a rough start since Python's package landscape was dominated by setup tools. But Flit's simplicity and focus on only solving the easy cases showed a way forward. Multiple interoperating tools that all agree on the format of the artifacts they produce and consume. And so began the era of standardization. Everything setup tools defined implicitly is now written down. Things like what a distributed archive containing a project should look like, how to interpret and compare version strings, how project names are normalized for case-insensitive comparison, how a project is built from source, and so on. When the data formats are specified, then individual tools can be swapped around. Setup tools becomes just one of many choices, and better alternatives get a chance to overtake it. And so the command to build and install a Python project is no longer setup-py-install. Most projects will now tell you to use python-m pip install name of the project or the current directory, but it's perfectly fine to run another tool that can read the appropriate metadata, install the necessary dependencies, and run a project-specific system like setup tools Flit or CMake. And Fedora now has tools for this. Instead of py3build, the old macro that runs setup-py, you would now use pyproject-wheel and pyproject-install. These are named after the new configuration file, pyproject.toml, but they fall back to setup-py if the file is missing. Unfortunately, there are some build systems that do not have these newly standardized hooks. If your package uses something else than setup tools, Flit, or Poetry, we'll be glad to chat about it and see how we can move forward, but we might not end up with a refreshed spec file. Now, as we designed these macros, we considered what a Fedora packager does. Our job as distro packagers is to integrate software into a larger cohesive system. We monitor and communicate with upstreams and release new versions. Sometimes we need to do a bit of patching, change the software a bit to fit the other parts of the distro. Sometimes we just need to apply some configuration. But as part of this system integration, packagers also do quality control, verify that the entire distro actually works together, check licenses, verify that we can legally distribute it all together. We handle reports from users, since we often need to add system-specific info before we pass the report on to the upstream. We need to curate metadata, provide names that don't conflict, version numbers that can be compared uniformly, and descriptions that fit the distro style. To actually get a piece of software built, we also need to specify build time and runtime dependencies, and write down the commands to build and install the software. Now the question is, how much of this actually adds value, and how much of it is repeating what the upstream projects already do? Now, since the Python dependencies are now available in well-specified formats, there's no reason to repeat them in the spec file, at least for the Python ones. Version numbers are now standardized. The mechanics of Python versions are a bit different from what RPM needs, but we can convert automatically and use RPM for the dependencies. Quality control. Running tests is not officially standardized, but the popular Tox project aims to automate and standardize testing in Python, and allowing Fedora's use cases fits their mission. So we can automate testing for most projects. Now, license checking can't be automated, although there are some efforts in this area. Descriptions currently need to follow Fedora's unique style, and names are, well, a can of worms I'll open later. But still, we can save a lot of the data copying. We can use the upstream metadata, and stay in sync with it. Of course, sometimes the metadata needs to be adapted to Fedora, but then it should be treated as the code itself. If Fedora needs something extra, we patch it. Any patches are technical debt. They should be presented upstream and ideally eventually fixed there if that's possible. Now, the biggest of all these improvements is not having the dependencies in the spec file. Since each project can now use a different build system, finding where the requires and build requires are listed can be a bit inconvenient, especially if you're maintaining many different packages. But a repo query or a grep will usually answer your questions. Once you switch, you're not likely to go back. And now, names. Naming is hard. Python packages have 4 kinds of names, which you should keep as similar as possible, but sometimes it's not possible. These are the Fedora component name, the Fedora build RPM name, the project name as it appears on PyPI or is installed by pip, and the importable module you use in the Python code. Usually the latter 2 will be the same and you just add the Python 3 or Python prefix for the Fedora names, but sometimes you might run into complications. One of the complications is that upstream projects use the PyPI namespace. If you see pytest equals 624 in an upstream Python project, the pytest is the name on PyPI. PyPI is the namespace everybody uses. Allowing alternative namespaces has been discussed upstream, but so far no one thinks it's worth their effort to allow it. And so the project name in Fedora packages must match the project on PyPI, or at least the name needs to be reserved on PyPI to avoid future duplicates. That's a hard requirement in the new guidelines, and the automation relies on this. It's not too hard to deal with PyPI, but the Red Hat Python main team is happy to handle it for you if you want. Another new guideline has to do with tests. If possible, tests should be run when the package is built. Python's compiler doesn't catch very many errors, so tests are essential to verify that software works. On the other hand, code style checkers and linters should only be used in the upstream project, not in Fedora. These usually find things like questionable formatting or too short variable names, and a distro is not the place to fix issues like that, nor to check them. And that's it. If you're on the workshop, go ahead and show us your package or project. Hopefully we can come up with a diff like this one. This is from the Fedora change proposal. If you're watching this after the workshop, check out the links below and direct any questions to the Python-SIG mailing list or Fedora Python on Libera Chat. Happy packaging!